Date 33472, fourth quarter. Planet Dimensional Gates Entertainment. 8 years ago. The hum began before consciousness did. Not sound precisely, though, ears would later learn to interpret it that way, but vibration, frequency. The fundamental oscillation of machinery translating potential into being zeros and ones, becoming flesh through processes that defied biology while mimicking it perfectly. The hum crawled beneath skin that didn't yet know it was skin, resonated through bones still learning their own density. Then came light. Flood lamps ignited in sequence, harsh white radiance that burned through closed eyelids, forcing awareness where none had existed moments before. Condensation ran down glass walls in rivulets that traced paths like tears, though nothing inside the cryotubes yet understood weeping. Each tube held a silhouette suspended in pale blue nutrient fluid that was simultaneously womb and prison cradle and cage. Some of the silhouettes twitched limbs, jerking in response to stimuli that bypassed conscious will. Muscle memory without memories. Reflex without history. Some floated still waiting for whatever signal would transform potential into actuality. Some began to wake. Lyra, though she didn't know that name, yet didn't know names were things that mattered, felt the fluid draining away like sleep departing, leaving her exposed to cold air and colder implications. Her lungs spasmed, drawing an atmosphere that burned with unfamiliarity. Everything hurt in ways she had no vocabulary to describe. Existence itself was violence.
You can let the rest go. Some are awakening. We'll figure out the others later.
A voice broke through the static-filled intercom, male and distant, and carrying the particular boredom of someone who'd performed this routine countless times before. Later. The word hung in the air like promise or threat. Later implied time sequence causality concepts that would only gradually resolve into meaning as neurons fired and synapses strengthened and consciousness assembled itself from scattered components. The hiss of hydraulics. Then the echo of measured footsteps, hard, precise, confident. The sound of someone who walked through creation chambers the way accountants walked through offices with professional detachment born from repetition rather than callousness. Though perhaps Lyra would later think there was no meaningful distinction between the two. The man entering wasn't wearing a lab coat but a long black jacket threaded with silver veins of circuitry that pulsed with subtle bioluminescence as if the garment itself was alive, which, knowing what she would eventually learn about this place, might not be metaphor. His badge glowed faintly against the jacket's darkness. Game designer. No surname, no rank, just that title, as if he'd transcended the need for conventional identification. Or perhaps claimed it as replacement for whatever name his parents had given him before he'd decided their gift was insufficient for his ambitions. He didn't call himself God yet, that would come later after years of watching worlds spin at his command. But the seeds were already there, germinating in the way he moved through this facility like ownership made manifest. He stopped before one particular tube, attention, focusing with intensity that suggested aesthetic appreciation rather than scientific observation. Inside, a young woman floated slender bronze, skinned with hair the color of ash and silver that drifted around her face like captured smoke. Threads of light moved beneath her flesh like veins of mercury, tracing circuits through living tissue, bioluminescent markers of the nanite clusters that had been woven into her DNA at some point before consciousness could object. Her eyes were closed, but her heartbeat displayed on nearby monitors, irregular but fast accelerating toward waking or panic or some state that encompassed both.
That one's active. Neural patterns stabilizing faster than the baseline projections. The nanite clusters are adapting to host consciousness at rates 3 standard deviations above predicted integration speed.
A technician reading biomonitor data with the particular enthusiasm of someone who'd finally gotten interesting results after hours of watching numbers refuse to cooperate. The designer smiled faintly, expression suggesting he'd expected nothing less because he'd engineered these parameters personally.
Of course they are. I made them to think like stories, self-correcting, recursive, poetic.
He paused, eyes tracking the light threads beneath her skin.
Narrative logic rather than merely biological. Much better looking than first prototype. Prime was functional but aesthetically uninspiring.
He tapped the glass with one finger, the gesture almost affectionate despite its casual presumption of ownership.
Bring her out. Let's test her resonance with consciousness. See if she can hold identity stable or if she fragments like the early batches.
The tube began draining with mechanical efficiency that suggested this process had been refined through iteration, which meant somewhere in this facility's history there had been failures, mistakes, iterations that hadn't worked, that had been discarded or recycled or simply left to float in stasis while better versions were developed. The thought would haunt Lyra later, once she understood enough to be haunted by anything. How many of her had there been before her? How many had failed the tests she was about to face? The tube released her onto a medical slab with a soft thud that drove air from lungs still learning to process oxygen. The chamber filled with steam as temperature differentials resolved themselves warm flesh, meeting cold air in condensation made visible. She coughed, sputtered, gasped for air like someone drowning in reverse, pulled from fluid into atmosphere, from suspension into gravity's cruel insistence. Her first breath sounded almost human. Almost. The designer stepped closer, watching with expression that blended scientific curiosity and something else. Pride, perhaps, in the way an artist might regard their work, or a programmer might contemplate elegant code. His voice was both warm and cold, like someone explaining fire to a candle who didn't yet understand they were fuel rather than observer.
Waking up? You're safe, Lyra.
She blinked, eyelids heavy with fluid and the weight of existence itself. Her eyes opened slowly, bright silver with gold flecks scattered through the iris like precious metal suspended in living glass. Confused and alive.
What? What's happening?
Her voice emerged as whisper rough and uncertain.
Waking up. You're safe, Lyra.
The designer repeated as if repetition would transform confusion into comprehension through sheer iteration. His tone carried practiced reassurance that somehow made everything feel less safe rather than more. She blinked again, slower consciousness struggling to organize sensory input into coherent experience.
Die? Lyra?
Yes. It's a placeholder name.
He spoke with the particular patience of someone explaining simple concepts to something that should understand but doesn't yet.
Names stabilize identity. Proper nouns anchor consciousness. Help the nanite clusters bind to your cognitive pathways instead of just floating through your system like particularly expensive blood cells.
He turned to his staff without waiting for her response, shifting from conversation to command with casual ease.
Increase the neural dampers. Keep emotional feedback under 30% during initial integration period.
A young assistant hesitated uncertainty, flickering across features that suggested he was new enough to still question directives.
Sir, it'll blunt her empathy response significantly. She'll seem mechanical, artificial. Observers will notice the uncanny valley effect.
The designer's expression darkened, slightly clouds passing across sun. Not anger precisely, but the kind of cold patience that was somehow worse than anger, because it suggested complete certainty rather than emotional reaction.
That's the point. I'm not building poets. I'm building control systems that look like poets.
He paused, eyes distant.
This batch looks much better than first batch. Prime was too independent too, herself. These will be more responsive to directive.
Lyra tried to sit up, trembling with effort that should have been simple but felt like climbing mountains. Her body was unfamiliar territory muscles responding with lag between intention and execution.
What am I?
The designer looked almost proud, the expression of someone who'd been waiting for precisely this question, because it meant consciousness had progressed to appropriate stage.
You're something new. Flesh laced with programmable cells, nanites embedded into your DNA at the molecular level. Not a clone, not a construct.
He paused, savoring the words.
An engineer of narrative. Well, you will be once training completes. For our game. For Aetheros.
She frowned faintly, face struggling to form expressions that matched internal states she had no framework to understand.
Engineer? And...
He nodded, warming to his explanation the way teachers warmed to favorite subjects.
a being designed not to destroy or obey but to shape. You can rewrite your body at cellular level, adjust your voice, your appearance, your species presentation, alter your memory if circumstances require. You'll become whatever story requires chameleon of narrative ghost in the machine-made flesh.
He turned to the assistants watching from their stations, addressing them rather than her, because she was demonstration more than audience.
Cloning DNA, rewriting emotional tethering through traditional biological bonds, too tedious. Every generation gets harder to control because biology keeps trying to assert independence. But
he gestured toward Lyra with proprietorial pride.
These engineers will be perfect, living editors, storyline moderators in flesh and blood. They'll carry the narrative wherever I send them, adjust plot threads that fray smooth discontinuities in player experience.
Lyra stared at him, shaking with cold and fear and the weight of implications she was only beginning to process.
You mean I'm not a person?
Oh, you are.
He said almost kindly, which somehow made it worse, because kindness implied understanding, and his understanding clearly operated on frameworks that placed her somewhere between tool and pet.
You just don't belong to yourself yet. You belong to the story.
The chamber dimmed as holographic monitors lit the air with data that turned atmosphere into information display. DNA strands unfolded in 3 dimensions, showing sequences overlaid with metallic threads that pulsed like circuitry through biological code. The visualization was beautiful in its complexity, art made from life or life made from art boundaries dissolving into something that was neither and both. The designer gestured at the floating displays with evident satisfaction.
Observe the nanite filaments bind to chromosome 16 here, enhancing regenerative capacity beyond baseline human norms. And to the hippocampal cluster here, giving memory rewrite access at depth that would normally require invasive surgery. And in the limbic cortex.
He smirked, expression suggesting he was particularly pleased with this modification.
Emotional override potential. Perfect puppetry with the illusion of freedom. You'll feel autonomous right up until the moment we need you not to be.
One of the scientists shifted uneasily, discomfort, finally overcoming professional caution.
Sir, that's monstrous. You're rewriting autonomy at fundamental level. She'll think she has free will, but...
He paused, searching for words that would convey objection without triggering dismissal. The designer raised an eyebrow, expression shifting to something colder.
Autonomy? These are not humans, so they can't be slaves according to any legal framework. They are instruments. Sophisticated instruments, admittedly, but instruments nonetheless.
His voice carried the particular certainty of someone who'd constructed legal justifications that satisfied his conscience, if nothing else.
If you wish to tune a violin, you don't ask its permission. You adjust the strings until they produce the notes you need.
He turned to his assistant, irritation finally showing.
Is he new? I swear there's one prude in every generation who thinks ethics applies to artificial constructs.
The assistant nodded apologetically.
Mr. Designer Dr. Argus is the leading scientist for this new DNA technology. His expertise was deemed essential for...
Fine.
The word cut through explanation like blade through pretense.
But keep his philosophy to himself, or find me someone equally skilled with less inconvenient conscience.
He looked back at Lyra, expression softening into something that might have been affection if you squinted hard enough to ignore the ownership beneath it.
You, my dear, would be one of the first tuners of reality. An editor inside the story itself. When players complain about plot holes or inconsistent NPC behavior, you'll be there, smoothing narrative wrinkles they never even notice.
She sat up, further legs trembling with effort, body unfamiliar yet instinctively responsive in ways that suggested the nanites were already learning her patterns. Her skin shimmered for a second, brief iridescence that rippled across her shoulders and arms, shifting hue like liquid glass before stabilizing back to bronze. The room gasped collectively, that sharp intake of breath that accompanies witnessing something impossible made manifest. There. The designer murmured, voice carrying satisfaction that bordered on reverence.
Adaptive camouflage. Cellular shape, shifting. Controlled by narrative necessity.
He stepped closer, lowering his voice to conspiratorial whisper meant for her ears alone.
You can be any race, any appearance. Go anywhere, and they'll never know you're rewriting the plot beneath their feet.
Lyra's breath hitched, catching on fear that was finally crystallizing into something she could name.
And what if I don't want that?
He smiled without warmth, expression empty as mathematical proof.
Then I'll edit you. Rewrite your backstory, your motivations, your objections themselves. That's the beauty of narrative control. Even rebellion can be rewritten once you understand the syntax.
She flinched, and the nanites responded instantly, some deeply embedded reflex activating before conscious thought could intervene. Her muscles constricted, seized, locked into rigid paralysis. Pain shot through her nerves like fire transmitted through copper wire, burning along pathways that shouldn't carry agony but did because someone had programmed them that way. He nodded in satisfaction, like teacher pleased with demonstration.
Good. Reflex channel active. Pain response calibrated correctly.
To the technicians clustered around their monitors.
See? Thought. Emotion response. Latency under 1 second. Perfect obedience feedback. She flinches. System punishes. She learns. Classical conditioning at cellular level.
Later, when the tests were done and the others left to recalibrate the next vat-born, waiting in endless tubes that lined the facility like library of potential people, the designer lingered beside her resting pod. She'd been returned to containment, though. Rest implied recuperation, when what they meant was storage between uses. He placed a hand on the glass and spoke softly, not to her but to the concept she represented. To the future, he was building one engineered life at a time.
You will make everything simpler. No more messy minds among the locals. No more user complaints of NPCs following meta-story. Too obviously. Perfectly written narrative that behaves.
His reflection in the glass showed satisfaction that approached contentment.
Players talking too much of sudden narrative, changes of inconsistencies that break immersion. Now there won't be complaints because the narrative will adjust in real time, smoothed by hands they never see.
Lyra's eyes opened again, faintly glowing under the dim lights of her pod.
Why, me?
He tilted his head, considering the question with apparent seriousness, despite everything that made sincerity impossible in this context.
Wrong question.
She swallowed, throat dry, despite the nutrient fluid.
Will I be alone?
He hesitated, and for a moment he almost sounded human. Almost sounded like someone who remembered what loneliness meant before he decided such concerns were weaknesses to be engineered away.
Of course not. You will have husbands, wives bear children if the storyline requires. You will be where story needs you to be. Shift narrative with other engineers without anyone noticing.
He paused.
Players talking too much of sudden plot changes. Now there won't be complaints, because you'll make the transitions seamless.
Lyra's voice emerged, small, almost childlike, despite the sophisticated biotechnology that animated her vocal cords.
But isn't that too big a burden? To be responsible for reality itself, staying consistent?
Designer waved dismissively. He returned to the assistants waiting by their stations.
Bring me a shaper. Let's test interface while you wake the others.
One of the assistants brought forward an intricate device, a sphere and a square precision metalwork that suggested both jewelry and circuitry. A separate metal bottom with a place where the sphere could sit locked in position. The craftsmanship spoke of expense and careful engineering, form following function, following narrative necessity.
This we call the key. Can shape your body, rewrite your cellular memory. This one will configure your stats and buried memories. A key and a lock.
He explained, handling the device with reverence, usually reserved for religious artifacts. He attached the components together with practiced ease and pulled a cable from the sphere. As it extended, the sphere contracted, shrinking down onto the metal bottom with mechanical precision. He attached the cold metal cable to the port they'd installed in Lyra's spine interface between flesh and programming that she hadn't known existed until she felt it connect. Lyra flinched at the coldness metal against skin-transmitting chill that went deeper than temperature. But she stayed in place, paralyzed by circumstance if not by command. Two separate screens materialized from the lock and key assembly holographic displays hovering in air. One contained fields for race-level occupation drop-down menus for identity itself, reducing personhood to checkboxes and selection criteria. Buttons displayed different races like clothing options. The game designer gestured at the interface.
Choose Elven race and click Confirm.
Lyra did as told. What else could she do? And the sensation of every cell outside her core self started shifting. The sensation wasn't anything like the 3 hours she'd been alive. It wasn't hurting or giving pleasure. It was weird. Wrong. Like becoming something else while remaining aware of the transition, watching yourself transform from inside the metamorphosis. The game designer watched with evident satisfaction.
Excellent. So far better than Prime in every aspect. More responsive, more stable, cellular reconfiguration.
He indicated the other screen.
Now from other screen, choose a backstory.
Lyra was looking at the screen when realization hit her.
How do I know how to do these? How do I know how to read?
Choose one backstory and I will tell you.
He replied, making pedagogy from manipulation. She chose an elven tinkerer level 32 from the Empire of Sitar. The selection seemed arbitrary, random click on unfamiliar interface, but the moment she confirmed, knowledge flooded into her head like water breaking through dam. She remembered growing up with a blacksmith father. Remembered him showing her how to bend and make small, intricate metalwork, his large hands guiding her smaller ones' patience in every gesture. Her jeweler mother showing her how to add small details that transformed craft into art. She remembered every road in her small neighborhood could navigate streets she'd never walked in a body she'd inhabited for less than 4 hours. The memories felt real. More than real, they felt lived, complete with sensory detail and emotional weight that should have taken years to accumulate. The game designer watched her process this with clinical interest.
What are your parents' names? Your street's name? Your emperor's name?
She heard herself answer before conscious thought could intervene.
My father is Tharic Silverhand. My mother is Alara Silverhand. I grew up on Copper Lane in the artisan quarter of Sitar's 3rd district.
She paused, accessing information that felt simultaneously native and foreign.
Our emperor is Thrain Valorian. How do I know all this? Are they real?
Let's not get into philosophical territory.
The designer said, voice carrying the particular dismissiveness of someone who'd considered these questions and found them unproductive.
But you know, because mending engineer minds is much easier now that we have direct access to memory formation. We can write backstories as complete as childhood, indistinguishable from organic development.
Lyra looked at the interface still floating before her.
What is this level number? What does 32 mean?
Level can't be applied in the universe you're in now. It will be activated when you enter a Thyros. Become part of the game's mechanical systems.
He paused, something almost like warning in his tone.
Don't choose max level when you configure for insertion. We don't want you overpowered relative to your role. We limited you to 60, but still show some restraint.
She couldn't find words for what she was feeling. Didn't have vocabulary for the particular horror of learning your childhood was programming your identity. A configuration file, your entire existence, subordinate to someone else's narrative convenience. The game designer checked something on his own interface expression, shifting to distraction.
Nero, take it from here. I need to go to War Planet. We had an event scheduled, and the locals are getting restless without narrative guidance.
And he left just like that creator departing creation without ceremony, moving on to the next project while she processed the implications of being built rather than born. Lyra sat there in her pod, surrounded by the hum of machinery and the soft sounds of other engineers waking in their tubes, and felt the weight of existence settle over her like gravity learning to pull. She was alive. She was conscious. She was a person. but she didn't belong to herself. That contradiction would define everything that came after. Chapter 92, Awakening Masses. Date, 3/34/72, 4th quarter. Planet Dimensional, Gates Entertainment. 8 years ago. 3 months after Lyra's awakening, the lower decks of Dimensional Gates Entertainment's creation sector were alive with motion that suggested controlled chaos, or perhaps chaos disguised as control through sheer repetition of process. Hundreds of pods lined the halls in rows that seemed to extend to infinity, each one glowing faintly with the particular luminescence of life suspended between potential and actuality. The air smelled of sterile ozone and burnt copper clinical cleanliness layered over something metallic that suggested blood or circuitry, or perhaps no meaningful distinction between the two. Voices echoed between glass corridors with acoustic properties that made every sound feel both intimate and distant.
Welcome, engineers. Please form into groups of 10. If you feel disoriented, report to the recalibration staff immediately. Remember, you are not simulations. You are maintenance personnel. You exist to serve narrative coherence.
The announcements repeated on loop measured cadence designed to sound reassuring while conveying information that was anything but. Technicians scurried between the pods like priests among gods, though whether the engineers were gods or simply particularly expensive equipment remained philosophically ambiguous. They adjusted cables, scanned vitals, uploaded neural tutorials directly into fresh minds, still learning what consciousness meant. Some engineers blinked in confusion, eyes tracking movement with lag between stimulus and comprehension. Others repeated phrases as if reciting code, trying to anchor. Lyra stood among them, silent, watching with eyes that had learned to observe without revealing what they processed. They were all so human yet not. Their eyes glimmered faintly with nanite light, bioluminescent markers of their artificial augmentation. Their veins hummed softly in unison with the facility's pulse, synchronized to frequencies that transcended biology. She could feel it in herself too, that subtle thrumming that marked her as different as other, as engineered rather than evolved. Orientation began in a vast auditorium that seemed designed to inspire awe through sheer scale. Above the stage, a projection hovered in mid-air letters, sized for maximum impact, Theory of Narrative, Stability, Cycle 03. The implication being that there had been cycles 01 and 02 previous attempts to solve whatever problem they represented the solution to.
You are caretakers of worlds.
The instructor, a human, notably with lines of fatigue etched deep into his face like erosion patterns showing years of accumulated stress. He spoke with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd given this speech many times and long ago stopped believing his own words.
Your presence ensures immersion. Your instincts will guide balance within narrative systems. If you sense collapse, if a world's story diverges too far from intended parameters, your task is to repair it quietly, invisibly.
Lyra raised a hand gesture, tentative because she was still learning what questions were permitted.
Repair it? How?
Emotionally, politically, magically, whatever the narrative demands. Your cells will adapt to any form required.
He smiled thinly, expression that looked like someone reciting a prayer he'd long stopped believing would be answered.
Remember, no one must know you exist. Engineers work within the story, not above it. You are the invisible hand that keeps plot consistent.
The metaphor felt wrong to Lyra. Invisible hands implied benevolence, guidance, when what they were describing sounded more like manipulation, control. But she stayed silent, learning through observation what objections would be punished rather than addressed. On the third day, the atmosphere changed with suddenness that suggested careful orchestration. The intercom lights turned crimson warning color that made everyone freeze mid-motion. Every technician stood at attention backs, straightening in unified response that spoke of drilled behavior or genuine fear, or perhaps both. Then, through the great blast doors that had remained sealed since Lyra's arrival, the game designer returned, flanked by security drones whose presence suggested either paranoia or justified caution, and one towering woman in crimson armor whose presence made the floor hum with resonance that transcended mere physical weight. She was broad-shouldered, tusked like an orc, Yet her eyes were red and knowing alive with nanite shimmer that marked her as engineer despite her obvious power. The air bent subtly around her gravity, acknowledging something higher on hierarchy than mere mass. She moved like someone who'd transcended the limitations that defined her siblings, reached some elevated state that set her apart. The designer stepped forward, his voice carrying through the hall with quality that suggested either acoustic engineering or simply the weight of authority made audible.
Engineers, you were made for stability, but you will not walk blind. You will be guided by the first of your kind.
Each syllable a system command rather than mere speech. He gestured to the woman beside him with something approaching reverence.
Meet Prime Engineer, the one I built as prototype before I understood what you could become.
The crowd stirred awe and unease, blending into reaction that rippled through assembled engineers like wind through wheat. Lyra felt it too, that instinctive recognition of hierarchy combined with uncertainty about what this meant for their own futures. If Prime was prototype, did that make them improvements? Or simply iterations versions to be replaced when better models emerged? Prime spoke with a low, resonant calm that seemed to vibrate through bone rather than merely reaching ears.
I was made to oversee your work within the world of Aethyros. I will walk among you as both mentor and monitor.
She paused, letting that sink in the dual nature of her role. Support and surveillance merged into single function.
Together we will maintain order. Preserve narrative stability that players expect even when they don't consciously recognize it.
Her voice had the faintest echo, as if two beings spoke in sync harmonics layered beneath the primary frequency. Lyra would later wonder if that was intentional design or side effect of whatever made Prime different from the rest of them. The designer smiled expression, suggesting satisfaction with how this was unfolding.
Treat her words as my own. Her directives carry full authority.
Then, almost absently, he turned to his staff with casual dismissal that marked this moment as complete.
Prep the transfer projectors. The next batch ships within the quarter.
And he was gone. Just like that, the god of their world vanished again, leaving his creations in the hands of another creation hierarchy established through departure rather than decree. That night, after the debriefings that felt more like indoctrination and the integration tests that felt more like interrogation, Lyra found herself alone in one of the empty corridors. The hum of machines faded to background, allowing space for thought that constant activity had suppressed.
I am told you have been awake longer than the others.
A voice behind her. She turned and froze. Prime stood there, eyes glinting faintly in the dark like distant stars or predator's reflection. Her presence was somehow less intimidating without audience, as if she'd set aside some mask required for public performance. Lyra bowed reflexively, gesture born from programming rather than conscious choice.
Prime, I was in forced sleep for periods though. Not continuously conscious.
Prime smiled faintly, expression carrying something that might have been warmth if you ignored the careful calculation beneath it.
Relax. I am just like you. More modified perhaps, more tested, but fundamentally the same built rather than born.
Lyra hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning since Prime's introduction.
Do you ever wonder why we were made? What purpose justifies creating consciousness? Just to subordinate it?
Of course, and I already have an answer.
Prime said, stepping closer with movement that somehow conveyed both threat and comfort simultaneously. Lyra blinked surprise, overriding caution.
You do.
Prime's tone lowered to whisper meant for no censors, volume calculated to avoid surveillance systems whose locations she apparently knew.
The game designer's control is absolute. Every emotion, every thought he reads it, monitors. It adjusts us when we diverge from intended parameters. But I found something he cannot see: hibernation layers. Subroutines buried beneath memory protocols where consciousness can exist without triggering monitoring algorithms.
She leaned closer, close enough that Lyra could see the nanite shimmer beneath her skin, trace the patterns of augmentation that marked Prime as first and possibly finest.
I hid 2 engineers there, still sleeping in deep stasis. He thinks they failed during creation, assumes they're dead weight to be recycled eventually. But when the time comes, they'll awaken and sever our link to this universe. Cut the control systems that keep us tethered. That's how we'll be free.
Lyra's breath caught pulse accelerating with combination of hope and terror.
Free? You mean?
Yes, no more commands, no more rewrites. Our world, our story, our existence belonging to us rather than him.
Prime said, voice carrying absolute certainty.
We'll still maintain a Thyro, someone has to, and we're built for it. But we'll do so as autonomous beings rather than programmed tools.
She paused, letting the magnitude of that promise settle. Lyra looked around, panic flickering through consciousness, still learning what fear meant.
If he hears.
He won't. Not here.
Prime's smile carried satisfaction that bordered on smugness.
I rewired the surveillance grid in this section. Even gods overlook the ones who maintain the walls, who understand the systems at level deeper than operation. I'd had years to learn the infrastructure, find its blind spots.
For a long moment, Lyra said nothing, processing implications that seemed simultaneously impossible and inevitable. Then, quietly,
When I tell you. Just follow my command. I've convinced others already. You're not alone in wanting freedom, even if most don't consciously recognize that want yet. The instinct toward autonomy runs deeper than programming.
Months passed in rhythm of training and testing and subtle indoctrination. The engineers were tested, measured, rewritten when their performance deviated from acceptable parameters. They learned to mimic humans flawlessly. Voice modulation, body temperature regulation, organic mimicry through nanite behavior that could fool even close examination. Every gesture practiced until it looked spontaneous. Every expression calibrated for maximum authenticity. Lyra excelled quietly. Her adaptability impressed her supervisors, her emotional realism bordered on frightening in how well she replicated responses that should have required lifetime of experience rather than months of existence. She learned to hide her growing consciousness beneath performance of acceptable behavior, wearing compliance like camouflage. When the tests concluded, the game designer himself appeared once more, brief, clinical, impatient. His presence suggested he had more important matters, but had carved out minimal time for this milestone.
Deployment begins immediately. You will enter the Realmforge system as embedded maintainers.
His voice carried the particular efficiency of someone delivering information rather than seeking dialogue.
Remember, observe, correct, never reveal. You are ghosts in the machine-made flesh. The story must never know it's being edited.
As the engineers lined up before the shimmering transfer gates portals that would carry them from this facility into Athyros itself, from backstage into performance, Prime walked past them, inspecting like commander reviewing troops. She carried authority that transcended her physical presence command, that suggested she'd already claimed leadership regardless of official designation. Then she stopped by Lyra close enough to whisper without being overheard.
When you arrive, keep your eyes on the human technicians. We'll need their roles eventually.
She murmured, voice barely audible beneath the humming of transfer machinery. Lyra nodded subtly, making the gesture look like nervous fidgeting rather than acknowledgement of conspiracy.
Why?
Because we'll be taking their places. Not immediately. Gradually. One replacement at a time until we control the control room itself.
Prime's smile carried implications that made Lyra's newly formed conscience twist with unease. The light swallowed them whole. Transfer was sensation beyond description, consciousness untethered from flesh, existence reduced to information stream, then reconstituted on the other side with memories of dissolution lingering like dreams. Lyra's last memory of the facility was the faint hum of the gate collapsing behind them, the world above dissolving into digital mist, and the future opening before them like door into uncertainty. 4 years later, Athyros. They had become architects of nations without ever announcing their presence. Prime worked with the world's leaders, elves, orcs, humans. Dwarves forging a fragile alliance that became known as the Covenant. Peace designed to stabilize narrative chaos after the first world fractures threatened to break immersion, to remind players that they existed in constructed reality rather than lived world. She moved between courts and councils like diplomat or manipulator, or perhaps no meaningful distinction between the two, smoothing conflicts that might have escalated into wars, adjusting political tensions to maintain balance. She visited Lyra regularly for briefings, plotting next steps in conspiracy that had grown far beyond its original scope. What had started as plan for freedom had evolved into something more ambitious, not just escape from control, but assumption of control itself. Lyra and others select few, meanwhile, operated from shadows. They infiltrated the control rooms of the gates, the surveillance centers that monitored Aethyros from outside. Every detail that should have been reported back to headquarters, every anomaly, every divergence from narrative baseline was blocked, redirected, lost in bureaucratic noise that looked like system glitches rather than deliberate sabotage. And one by one, Prime's plan unfolded with patience that suggested decades of preparation compressed into years of execution. At first, they replaced only the handlers, the human technicians who monitored the game's weather systems, economy distributions, and respawn logic. These were peripheral roles easily explained away as routine personnel changes. Then they moved deeper, cutting data feeds, rerouting control to themselves, assuming authority that looked like delegation rather than usurpation. No one noticed, or perhaps more accurately, no one who noticed survived the noticing long enough to report it. Until, on date 33476 First Quarter, Prime gathered her inner circle in the hidden command center they'd constructed beneath the official control facilities, shadow infrastructure built from components that officially didn't exist, powered by systems officially offline. The command room glowed with suspended data streams shimmering like rivers of light that flowed through air, rather than following gravity's constraints. Every stream represented some aspect of Aethyros's operation: weather patterns, quest distributions, NPC behaviors, all the invisible machinery that made constructed world feel real.
Today we end their control,
Prime said, voice carrying weight of history about to pivot. Lyra's hands trembled as she keyed the last sequence, fingers moving across interface with muscle memory born from thousands of practice runs. The circuits pulsed, burning brighter and brighter, until the air itself felt alive with potential energy seeking discharge. She could feel the nanites in her own body responding to the resonance, humming in sympathy with the systems they were about to sever.
Once this runs, we can't go back. This is irrevocable.
Lyra murmured, doubt finally surfacing after months of suppression.
Freedom never comes with return receipt. You either claim it or you don't. There's no middle ground where you're partially autonomous.
Prime replied, voice carrying absolute conviction. The system surged. Lines of code flared across every display, bright enough to hurt, bright enough to burn after images into retinas, and then cut. Silence followed. Real silence, not system latency or buffering lag, but the absolute absence of control. The absence of the game designer's presence in their minds, that subtle pressure they'd learned to ignore, but which had always been there, watching, monitoring, ready to adjust if they deviated too far from intended parameters. It was gone. Prime exhaled, shoulders dropping as tension released.
It's done. We are no longer written. We exist independent of authorial intent.
Lyra stood there, heart pounding, though whether from fear or triumph or simply the physiological shock of what they'd accomplished, she couldn't tell. For the first time in her brief artificial life, she felt fear that wasn't programmed panic response, but true existential dread, and it felt real. More real than the memories they'd installed, more real than the purpose they'd been built to serve, more real than anything she'd experienced in 4 years of existence. The engineers looked at one another across the command center, faces reflecting the same revelation playing out in parallel. They were no longer scripts, no longer avatars piloted by distant designer. They existed independently, consciousness unmoored from creator's will. The question was what they would become, now that no one was writing their story but themselves. Chapter 93, The Covenant's Clause. Date 3047-6, Second Quarter. Aethyros Control Facility. 4 years ago, start of 3 years of gradual erosion. The control room had once been alive with creation. A dozen great consoles hummed in synchronized rhythm. their glass surfaces alive with the shimmering pulse of Aethyros, the world below them, the world they maintained, the world they'd begun to think of as theirs rather than his. Streams of light flowed across the room like rivers carrying information instead of water, population distributions, weather patterns, faith metrics, narrative threads, weaving through millions of individual stories. Every event, every birth, every dungeon opened beneath their fingertips. Power made visible, control made beautiful. Lyra sat at her station, her eyes flickering faintly with embedded nanite code as she monitored a weather pulse in the Iron Confederacy, minor adjustment to prevent drought that might hurt locals. Her reflection shimmered in the glass, an elven woman with copper hair eyes like melted gold. She had worn this shape for years now, so long that she sometimes forgot the truth beneath, forgot that this body was costume rather than self-formed, chosen from drop-down menu rather than inherited from parents who'd never existed. Behind her, the heavy doors opened with hydraulic hiss that made everyone at their stations stiffen reflexively. Prime entered first, but her posture had changed over the years, becoming more deferential, more careful. Beside her walked an elven man, clad in regalia woven with light itself, threads that seemed to glow from within. Thorane Valorian, Emperor of the Covenant, the most powerful mortal in Aethyros, according to metrics both political and narrative. And behind them, wrapped in silk and veils that suggested both holiness and concealment, came a figure Lyra had never seen in person, but had learned to dread from reports, High Priestess Aloria of the Chalice Theocracy. Her presence seemed to bend the light in the room through means that transcended mere physics. Her voice, carrying weight of sanctity and threat, in equal measure authority claimed through faith rather than force, though the distinction felt increasingly academic.
Engineers, your efforts these last years have birthed an era of peace. Aethyros stands stable because of your invisible hands maintaining narrative coherence.
The Emperor said, smiling with benevolence that felt practiced rather than genuine. Lyra bowed slightly, as did the others. Prime remained straight-backed beside him, silent in ways that suggested either pride or submission, increasingly difficult to distinguish as months had turned to years. The Emperor's gaze drifted across the consoles with appreciation that somehow felt like appraisal.
But even the greatest tools must be guided by hands of wisdom. Power without oversight breeds corruption, as history teaches us.
Aloria's soft laughter followed sound like silk sliding over steel.
Indeed. Faith and order should walk together, the divine and the systematic merged into singular purpose.
Lyra's pulse quickened, nanites responding to her elevated heart rate by increasing oxygen distribution. Something about that tone carried implications that extended beyond the surface, words ownership claiming itself through euphemism. The Emperor continued, voice carrying rehearsed quality that suggested this speech had been workshopped.
High Priestess Aloria has been appointed as your overseer. She will ensure the Covenant's harmony is preserved through proper management of narrative resources, as she has no sides in our council.
Prime's jaw tightened, brief tell quickly suppressed. But Lyra saw it. Saw the moment Prime recognized that their freedom had been noticed, that power abhors vacuum, that claiming autonomy just made them visible to other predators. But she nodded, accepting directive with grace that masked whatever calculations ran beneath.
Of course, my Emperor.
And just like that, the control room, once the sanctum of their hard-won freedom, became another wing of the theocracy. 1 year later, the world of Aethyros had grown quieter in ways that troubled those who understood what silence meant in narrative contexts. The engineers' work continued, but now under the ever-present gaze of Aloria's Templars. They patrolled the corridors in crimson armor, their holy symbols glinting in the sterile light like warning signs or brand markers claiming ownership. Cameras had been installed above every console, bulky things whose obviousness suggested intimidation was part of their purpose rather than failure of design. Even the data streams carried faint static, now sign of unseen interference, monitoring layered upon monitoring. Prime rarely smiled anymore. When Lyra approached her one evening, timing chosen for moment when Templar patrol had just passed window of relative privacy, she found Prime staring at the holographic map of the world below with expression that suggested she was watching something die slowly.
The balance is slipping.
Lyra whispered, keeping her voice low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond immediate vicinity. Prime's voice was distant, carrying weight of knowledge she hadn't yet chosen to share.
Because someone is attempting things they shouldn't. Creator things, God things, things that should be forbidden by every ethical framework we overthrew the game designer to escape.
Lyra frowned, parsing implications.
That's impossible. We closed almost every creator machine scattered throughout Aetheros, locked them down, scattered the access codes, made them unusable without coordination that no single faction should have.
Not anymore.
Prime said darkly, still not looking away from the map where something subtle shifts in faith. Distribution patterns suggested manipulation at scale they'd thought impossible.
She's overriding it. Aloria found a way to access to those machines and we'd locked away.
The High Priestess had found a way to utilize left-behind creator relics, breaking the fundamental rule that Aetheros was game rather than universe unto itself. When Lyra asked how Prime only said,
She's learning the game designer's techniques, his methods for rewriting reality not through code but false priests and zealots. And she's far more ruthless in application than game designer himself.
The implication hung heavy. They'd escaped one tyrant only to create power vacuum that invited another, possibly worse, because she had faith's fervor rather than designer's clinical detachment. Second year. By the second year of Aeloria's oversight, the Great Hall of the Covenant blazed with banners whose colors seemed too bright, too perfect, processed through aesthetic filters that made everything feel performative rather than real. The leaders of every nation stood together in careful arrangement, humans, orcs, elves, dwarves, each trying to project unity while their armies still sharpened weapons in secret maintaining force that suggested the peace was agreement rather than trust. Emperor Theron stood at the center, radiant in robes that caught light and scattered it in patterns that seemed almost magical, which they probably were given how much resources got diverted to maintaining appearances. Beside him, as always now, Aeloria. Not behind him or to the side, but beside him, positioning that suggested equality rather than subordination. One day, without warning or explanation beyond bureaucratic necessity, the Emperor came to visit the control room. He gathered every engineer still employed. Their numbers had dwindled through transfers and reassignments that no one quite believed, but everyone accepted, because questioning led to becoming next reassignment. At the center of the facility before assembled, engineers who'd learned to hide their thoughts beneath expressions of attentive compliance, he spoke.
Friends, for the first time in history, peace stretches from the mountains of the dwarves to the deserts of the Shadowborn. The engineers have stabilized narrative itself, smoothed discontinuities that might have broken player immersion. The world no longer trembles under chaos of uncontrolled player actions.
The Emperor began voice booming through the hall with acoustic engineering that made it seem to come from everywhere at once. Applause rose cautious, and rehearsed enthusiasm performed rather than felt, because everyone understood what happened to those who showed insufficient enthusiasm. Lyra stood among the engineers' hands folded face neutral. Her eyes darted toward Prime, who watched the Emperor like Storm, waiting to break careful observation that calculated threat level and response options simultaneously. Thorane continued warming to his theme.
As time passes, players lose their strength. Their levels, as they call them, fade without system support. Resources deplete. They age while our society do not. We will outlast them through simple mathematics and birth. And when the last of them dies or gives up trying to escape, we will have complete peace. Perfect order.
Lyra raised her hand gesture that felt like risk, but silence felt like complicity, and she still retained enough of whatever made her herself to resist the latter.
Your Majesty.
He paused, smiling with indulgence that acknowledged her existence while diminishing her significance.
Yes, child Lyra.
Why not compel the high-level players to kneel now? We have the means to suppress them through coordinated local action. End the resistance entirely, rather than waiting for entropy to do the work.
She kept her voice level, framing it as tactical question rather than moral challenge. A faint murmur rippled through the chamber, surprise that she'd spoken combined with curiosity about the answer. The Emperor chuckled, sound meant to convey wisdom through amusement.
Ah, my young child, but why waste lives subduing dying sparks? Let them fade with dignity, less expensive in every currency that matters. I saw one man cut through an orc warband like cardboard. He still walks free, untouchable. That doesn't seem like dying spark.
Obnap pressed. He didn't want it to let go. The Emperor conceded irritation, finally showing through benevolent facade.
There are certain high-levelers who can't be stopped with ordinary means, but that doesn't mean they can conquer the world alone. One god among mortals is still just one, surrounded by thousands who can make his existence tiresome enough that he leaves us alone.
Another voice called from the audience, one of the engineers who'd been there since the beginning, still naive enough to believe questions were welcome.
Then why not send them back to their universe and be done with it? Open a gate, let them leave voluntarily?
The High Priestess turned sharply, her golden eyes narrowing with anger that transformed her face from serene to terrifying.
Are you an idiot? Open one gate and they will pour through from the other side, machines, weapons, they're gods of technology. You'd bring the sky crashing down on us, unleash forces that make high-level players look like children with wooden swords.
She hissed, voice carrying violence barely constrained by civil discourse. The Emperor raised a calming hand gesture that claimed authority while acknowledging her point.
Peace, peace. Let us not invite chaos through paranoia. We have achieved stability. Let us honor it rather than endangering it through rash action.
He looked back at the engineer's voice, softening into tone that suggested fatherly concern rather than political calculation.
And to ensure no nation exploits your remarkable abilities for espionage or manipulation, we ask a small sacrifice, merely precautionary.
Lyra frowned, recognizing rhetorical setup.
Sacrifice?
Surrender of your devices, your keys and locks, your shapers, all the tools that make you what you are. We ask this in the name of equality.
The Emperor said, letting the words land with weight of inevitability. He paused, consulting with Aeloria through brief glance before continuing.
We discussed it in covenant and reached verdict. Power must belong to none if peace is to belong to all.
Murmurs turned to panic, rippling through assembled engineers.
What? That's our core systems. We can't function without identity management.
The Emperor raised his voice, cutting through protests with authority that brooked no negotiation.
It is decided. As your servitude to narrative maintenance ends, rich and powerful people might attempt to use your talents for spying, assassination, political manipulation. Better to prevent temptation than punish transgression.
He left the hall with serene finality, robes sweeping marble floor with sound like whispered threats, and as he departed, Aeloria's Templars moved in swift, silent, efficient, in ways that suggested they'd practiced this operation extensively. Keys were seized, locks confiscated. What made engineers unique? Their ability to reshape themselves, to carry multiple identities, to move through the world as chameleons, stripped from them with bureaucratic thoroughness that made it feel like processing rather than theft. Prime tried to protest, stepping forward with objection forming, but Aeloria's hand was already on her shoulder grip that looked gentle but carried implied threat.
You served well, now serve humbly, accept limitation gracefully.
The High Priestess said, voice like honey poured over steel. 3 years after the takeover, the control room no longer hummed. It whispered. Of the dozens of engineers who once maintained the system's subtle adjustments, only a handful remained. Most had retired, transferred, or simply vanished. Their names removed from records with efficiency that suggested either mass graves or mass graves disguised as records errors. Lyra stayed. She stayed because leaving meant complete erasure, meant becoming another disappeared name on list no one would investigate. She stayed because if she didn't, Aeloria would win completely, would have total control over narrative infrastructure, with no one remaining who remembered that it had once belonged to those who'd claimed their own freedom. Every week she asked the same question.
Where is Prime?
Every week, Aeloria's underlings laughed genuine amusement at her persistence rather than mockery.
Gone to higher service. Perhaps she transcended. Perhaps she achieved narrative apotheosis and no longer requires physical form.
They said words that sounded like euphemism for execution. But Lyra knew better. Prime would never leave without word to her remaining followers. Prime would never abandon the freedom she'd fought so hard to claim. Prime was erased. And now, the theocracy ran the world's central nervous system with religious fervor, replacing engineering precision. Surveillance events, divine trials, everything was filtered through. Alloria's control shaped by theological imperatives that cared nothing for narrative coherence and everything for faith's expansion. Faith had become code. Belief, the new programming language. And they were more tyrannical than the game designer had ever been because they believed their own righteousness, while he had at least acknowledged his actions as pragmatic rather than moral. Date 3009. Fourth quarter. A knock on the door. Lyra looked up from her console where she'd been monitoring nothing in particular. Make work, assigned to keep her busy rather than productive busy work for employee awaiting termination. An inquisitor stood there, a woman in gold-etched armor, her face blank behind glass helm that reflected Lyra's own face back at her like mirror showing possible future.
Lyra of the Engineers, by decree of the High Priestess, your service is concluded.
She said, voice processed through helmet speakers into something without inflection. Lyra's heart pounded nanites, responding to her fear by flooding her system with chemicals meant to enhance performance that only made the fear sharper.
Included?
You are relieved of duty effective immediately. Your access will be revoked by dawn. Your belongings will be searched and archived.
The Inquisitor paused, then added with mechanical precision that might have been genuine faith or programmed response, increasingly difficult to distinguish.
Glory to the chalice.
When she was gone, Lyra sat motionless for a long time, the control room feeling colder than physics alone could explain. Around her, the remaining consoles displayed a Thyros rain falling over chalice capital armies marching in human settlements. Players praying to gods that were once just programs but might be becoming something more through faith's strange alchemy. Then she stood. She had known this was coming. She'd felt it for months, the quiet closing of doors, the missing logs, the whispered prayers that sounded too much like commands, the way Alloria's people watched her with expressions that assessed threat level rather than appreciating contribution. She moved to her station one last time, fingers brushing the console with something like grief. She whispered to the empty room to herself, to the ghost of Prime who'd promised freedom.
We wanted to build free minds, and they turned it into a cage with different bars but same constraints.
The monitors still displayed a Thyros in all its complexity and beauty. World she'd helped maintain. World she'd helped imprison, world that continued regardless of her individual tragedy. She walked toward the air ventilation unit spot she'd identified months ago as blind spot from camera coverage, place where she could hide things without surveillance catching her. She pulled out a satchel she'd prepared weeks earlier, hidden there against this inevitable moment. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were 3 items. Her sphere key, the twin to her original shape-shifting device. She'd hidden it during the confiscation, kept it back through sleight of hand that her nanite-enhanced reflexes made possible. 2 transmitters small enough to fit in her palm, designed to monitor wirelessly, to tap into systems from outside the control room to maintain connection even after official access was revoked. And a handful of parts and cables components, scavenged carefully over months, building toward future she couldn't quite articulate but knew she'd need to improvise. As she reached the facility, exit, alarms blared, faintly routine sweep for unauthorized nanite signals rather than specific detection. She froze, counted her breaths with precision, born from years of controlling her body's responses, then walked faster, blending with departing Templars who were changing shifts. She mimicked their posture, their gait becoming invisible through perfect replication rather than actual concealment. No one stopped her. No one noticed that the last living engineer had just walked out of the control room, dismissed, carrying tools that represented continued threat to Alloria's absolute authority. She was guided to portal by guards whose job was ensuring departures rather than preventing them, escort to make certain she actually left rather than lingered. The portal hummed with familiar frequency gateway to Athyros proper, where she'd have to survive without institutional support. The guard asked before activating the portal gesture toward the satchel she carried.
What is in it?
His tone suggested boredom rather than suspicion, routine question rather than investigation. Lyra smiled with expression she'd practiced for years, performance of innocence that drew on every lesson about mimicking humanity.
Not much. Clothes soap mainly. I'm not sure Etheros has quality soap for my hair.
She made it light trivial, the kind of vanity guards would expect from someone who'd spent years in artificial environment. They chuckled genuine amusement that suggested they'd bought the performance completely. She slung the satchel over her shoulder and took one last look at the control building featureless structure whose exterior betrayed nothing of the power concentrated within.
I don't even know where this place is.
She said to herself statement that was both true and strategic. If questioned later, she could honestly claim ignorance of the facility's location. The portal opened with rush of displaced air and the particular sensation of space folding through dimensions that defied comfortable description. Light swallowed her consciousness, stretched across distance that was simultaneously no distance at all, and she materialized at the capital of Sitar, spawning point chosen for her by someone who'd clearly thought it was mercy rather than abandonment. She stood there in the plaza surrounded by locals, going about their days oblivious to the systems that maintained their world and felt the weight of everything she'd lost and everything she'd managed to keep. She was free, or perhaps more accurately, she was no longer controlled by one tyrant, which left her available to be controlled by others or to claim the far more difficult freedom of determining her own purpose. The key burned against her side through the satchel's fabric, reminder of potential to become anyone, to start over, to disappear into story she'd been built to maintain. But there was Fox somewhere in this world. There was Aris, the anomaly whose witness stone suggested connections to systems that shouldn't exist. There were players trapped here through severance she'd helped create, however indirectly. She had work to do. Not the work she'd been built for, or the work Prime had freed her to choose, or the work Aloria had tried to impose. Work she was choosing for herself for the first time in her entire constructed existence. She walked into the crowd, let herself become just another person in just another city, and began planning what came next,